World Energy Television presents this special on Restoring Confidence in America, the Need for Corporate Leadership. This fourth and final program of World Energy Television's 2002 season winds up a comprehensive look at the energy issues ahead for America.
Hello, and welcome to the conclusion of World Energy Television's roundtable broadcasts for 2002. I'm Doug Johnson, Associate Publisher of World Energy Magazine. Joining me as co-host is Lane Sloan, Executive Professor at the University of Houston and former CEO of Shell Chemical. Earl Swift is Chairman of Swift Energy Company. Since he began the company in 1979, it has grown to become a major oil and gas independent. Michael Grimes is President and Chief Executive Officer of Houston-based Stewart & Stevenson, now celebrating their 100th anniversary. In September, Steve Miller retired as Chairman and CEO of Shell Oil Company. Also joining us with roots as a chemical engineer with over 30 years of diverse experience, Carlos Jorda is President of PDV America, the U.S. subsidiary of the National Oil Company of Venezuela. He is also Chairman of Citgo Petroleum. Alan Beckman is Chairman and CEO of Fluor Corporation, one of the world's largest publicly owned engineering, procurement, construction, and maintenance services organizations. How does oil figure in the war against terrorism, and what are the challenges for energy industry leaders?
Certainly figures into the terrorist equation, because certainly some of the dollars that the free world spends on oil supplies, those dollars do end up to some extent in the hands of the terrorists. So there is a connection there.
Here is another angle at that question. Without oil, does anyone really believe that Iraq would have had the wealth to develop weapons of mass destruction?
Carlos, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that several issues. One is anything that has to do with the Middle East ends up to have a relationship with oil, and also it has a relationship with the State of Israel, which is an ally of the United States. If we look at the consequences of having weapons of mass destruction in the wrong hands, then it can translate into invasion of Kuwait or invasion of Saudi Arabia or attacks on neighboring countries that are oil producers, and an oil crisis could develop.
Sure. It's clearly when you're operating outside the United States in areas where there's not the political stability that you would like to have, the security of your employees, the ability to put some contingency plans in place to be able to protect those employees, to retrieve them or move them to safe places is of concern.
First of all, what we're doing is trying to protect our interests, and our interests are both physical interests, trying to not be harmed physically, and there's an economic interest. Certainly in that economic interest, oil is a part of the equation. Nothing is more vital to us economically than Mideast oil. But on the longer term, we really have to bring about a situation in the Mideast where we can begin to develop cultural changes so that the two peoples are not trying to kill each other.
That's an excellent point. Most industry observers will say that Middle East production keeps crude prices down. Is it conceivable that the American public could become so polarized against the Middle East that we would rather pay higher prices than buy from them?
I think if you look at the reserve levels in the world and where they are geographically and the overall production capacity, there's no doubt that the Middle East is a significant producer and supplier of oil. That in and of itself has a dramatic effect on pricing, just by virtue of their ability to control volumes.
Well, I tell you, it's been my experience that when you ask people to pay more, or people do sometimes say they're going to pay more for some social purpose, the behavior doesn't tend to follow that. I'm old enough to remember back to the Arab oil embargo in 1973, and I'll tell you, in those days, the American public didn't seem to be very tolerant of long lines and higher prices.
This nation has a great history of rallying around points, and once they're energized, the nation does come together. Whether, in fact, we get to the point of actually being willing to pay for higher prices so as not to take oil from the Middle East is, I think, a long ways away. You have to also understand that the world market is fungible. And so the fact that we might not buy a barrel of oil from Iraq, for example, doesn't mean that barrel of oil is not going to be sold. It will be sold someplace else.
I certainly agree with Steve on this. Oil is fungible, and it's unimaginable to me that we can live in a world in the current situation where the economics are not totally changed, both in the U.S. and globally with the disruption of either the market in the U.S. or production in the Mideast.
It is a commodity, and as the consumer looks at consuming that economy, that commodity, the question then becomes, how do you differentiate that product at the gas pump or as fuel oil? And will, in fact, that ability to try to pay more for a differentiated commodity end up having an impact on our economy?
Maybe the U.S. doesn't have a very clear energy policy yet, but let's say the energy behavior of both the governments in the past and now and the behavior of the public is that the U.S. wants abundant supply from a variety of regions, not necessarily one, at a cost that is at a balance that it allows new developments in other places in the world and in the U.S. And basically a question of readily available supply of energy.
Chevron CEO David O'Reilly states in the new issue of World Energy magazine, and I'll quote, "Simply declaring that your company won't do business in places where there are contentious issues isn't leadership and doesn't solve the problem," end quote. How does the energy industry take the leadership initiative to improve governance in developing countries? Steve, let's start with you.
I think David makes a great point. And I think you also have to keep in mind governance issues. Governance issues are local judgments, and we have to be careful not to impose our governance issues on others. On the other hand, the value systems that we have, you have to live up to, and you have to carry those into whatever environment that you have while respecting the local conditions.
We've seen time and time again that staying away from contentious issues, ignoring them and even hoping that they'll go away doesn't solve it. But when you are involved, particularly economically, you have an opportunity to affect both the political direction as well as the goodwill towards either companies or countries.
Let's now turn to our own government. A House Senate Conference Committee so far has been unable to reach agreement on new energy legislation. Of course, recent changes should affect this. If we don't open ANWR or build the Alaska pipeline, how must the energy industry respond?
Well, the things being considered by Congress really in a long-term planning situation for this country are on the margins. And what we really need to do is plan in a more global situation, looking at how can we use our resources, and then how can we import properly to protect ourselves and the economy. And finally, how do we plan for transitions? So we need all of those things. And the things that are currently being considered by Congress, while important, they're marginal.
Excellent point. Mike?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to recognize that our energy policy cannot be implemented in the vacuum without consideration of our environmental concerns. Technology has gone a long way towards helping us in terms of our ability to get oil out of the ground, to find it, to reduce the cost of it. But at the same time, the fuel selection, the technology choices that we make are driven by a political beast called our environmental awareness.
Alan, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, the energy industry they're all global players for the most part, and they're going to have to be able to meet the demand for their product, are going to have to develop sources of supply and production and then transport mechanisms to meet the supply. Without the ability to tap those areas that you talked about, they're going to have to look for alternate sources of supply. And if that's not the Mideast, it's going to be places like the former Soviet Union. It's going to be offshore Western Africa, or it's going to be in Southeast Asia.
One thing our lawmakers did accomplish in response to the failure of Enron and others is new legislation to regulate our stock markets. What has the Sarbanes-Oxley Act accomplished so far, and is this going to be a millstone around the neck of the energy industry? Alan, let's start with you.
First of all, let me say that, no, I don't believe it's going to be a millstone. I think given the situation, given the anxiety, and in fact what I would call the crisis of confidence in the market, that was in fact perpetrated by, I believe, the acts of a minority of businesses and business leaders, I think the world, our stock market and our economy needed some stabilization. And I think the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, among some other things, is moving to provide that.